Because have you ever wondered if our culture is going to hell in a handbasket? You were thinking about that this morning, Faith? Crazy. You know, it wasn't that long ago when being a Christian in our country was actually considered a social benefit. You know? Right? Where it was actually well esteemed to be a Christian, and a lot of culture generally assumed Christian principles. It was very unusual in the grand scheme of the world. Stores were actually closed on Sunday mornings. There were lots of television shows that were more wholesome, kind of catered to those Christian morals and ethics. Culture catered to Christianity in a very unusual way. In fact, there was a time period in American history where it almost seemed odd if you didn't profess to be a Christian. Now, it was a whole other discussion if you were a practicing Christian, right? But it is so embedded into our DNA that at the very least, even if people weren't Christians, they knew about church and they knew a semblance of what the gospel was. But we've started to see a drastic shift in culture over the past few decades, haven't we? Every year, it seems like the church and Christianity as a whole loses more and more influence it once had. And in fact, it's no longer considered a social benefit to be a Christian. Now it's becoming more of a social liability. Christians are written off as bigots half the time. They hear, you're a Christian, you must believe this, you're a bigot. We no longer have as strong of an influence in society as we once did, and more people are leaving the church every single year. According to Pew Research in 2009, 77% of American adults identified as Christians. That's a large amount of the population. But in 2019, that number dropped 12 points, with only 65% claiming to be Christian. And you might think, wow, 65%, that's still pretty good. Well, that was 6 years ago. And in case like that 1% is just a little too ambiguous, that essentially estimates to over 2 million people who walk away from their faith every year. Granted, perhaps a part of that could be people who aren't really ever Christians are now more comfortable with saying they're not Christians, so maybe they weren't ever Christians to begin with, or maybe we have more people from different faiths coming into our country, and so that changes the numbers a little bit. But either way, there is a large amount of people who are leaving the faith every single year. And our country and our culture and our society is changing because of it. And if you're still among the percentage of those who really do claim Christian values and to profess your faith in Jesus, it's not near as easy or assumed as it once was. And I think more often than not, our immediate response to that reality is to cower away and to hide. Coincidentally, I think that's exactly how the prophet Elijah felt during his lifetime. So if you have a Bible and you want to read along today, flip over or scroll over to 1 Kings 19. I'm reading in the New Living Translation. If you have the Bible app and you want to use the same translation so you're not kind of doing the mental translation in your head, that's sometimes a little easier. We're going to be cruising through this whole chapter today. I'm going to be jumping around quite a bit. But maybe you've heard of this guy before. Elijah was called by God to speak up against a people who were entirely obstinate to the Lord. But it's not like this group of people he was preaching against didn't know God. No, this was the people of Israel he was speaking against. God's chosen people to live in a covenant relationship with him, but who had totally turned their backs against him. Okay? Elijah was a prophet during one of the most culturally corrupt periods of Israel's history. They worshiped the idol god of Baal and followed the religion of their neighboring peoples, and it all eventually led to the climax of Elijah's prophetic career. Maybe you've heard the story before, where he's up against all these prophets of Baal, and he wins this contest by having God shower fire down on these bowls, doused in water, and it went up in flames, and they slaughtered a bunch of prophets of Baal. It was a good day of that day. It was awesome. It was awesome. It was a bloodbath. And we teach the story to kids, It's crazy. And it was a major victory. And so you would at least imagine that Elijah would have celebrated after he saw how God came through, right? Not at all. Check out what happens when Queen Jezebel, the wife of King Ahab of Israel, sent this word to Elijah in verse 2 when she says, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." In other words, Elijah, we're going to slaughter you just like you slaughtered all of our prophets. And so I think Elijah was right in his response to cower, run away, and hide. run for his life. He ran away into the wilderness and he prayed to the Lord that he might die. Verse 4 says, I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. Because he would rather God kill him than to have his life slain by his enemies. And so maybe you know how the rest of the story goes. God calls Elijah deeper into the wilderness and eventually winds up at Mount Sinai. This is an old mountain from their history as a people where God gave his people the Ten Commandments and the law and everything. And it's in this place when God meets Elijah and the voice of God spoke to him saying, what are you doing here, Elijah? Verse 14, he replies, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. And I am the only one left. And now they are trying to kill me too. I am the only one left. I am the only one left. Elijah felt completely isolated in his devotion to the Lord, how he upheld his life and his overall worldview. And he looked at his people, he looked at his country, who once represented the God of the universe to a pagan world drowning in their sin, and he mourns because it's all gone. He feels like he's the only one left, so he might as well have God take his own life before they do themselves. And I think the parallels of the church's place and our society and our time is uncanny. Granted, we don't have, a Queen Jezebel who's out to slaughter us. Praise God for that, because there are many countries out there where this is the reality. If they find out that you are believing in Jesus, they would kill you on the spot, right? So I don't want to make that drastic of a comparison, because we still have a lot of amazing religious freedoms and liberties here for us to do that. But perhaps where the parallel is there is we are mourning kind of this loss of God's people avidly living according to God's standards. All these people who are leaving his ways and how that's changing our culture and our society, right? More and more we have come under the influence of our own Jezebels, to put it lightly. And I think that a lot of today's church in the U.S. is mourning that loss of influence that we've had even just a century ago, right? We're becoming increasingly isolated, feeling perhaps maybe we're among the only ones left. And what's interesting is maybe you've probably felt this cultural shift the most the older you are and the longer you've been a Christian, okay? We've already talked about the rapid decline of Christianity even just over the last decade, but I believe we have a graphic here. Go ahead and throw this up, Laura, if you got it. So in case you can't read it, the font's kind of small. This shows the generation gap in American religious belief, okay? So the silent generation, or this was taken in 2018, 2019, okay? So the percentage of U.S. adults who identify as Christian decreases with every generation. The silent generation, those born between 1928 and 45, 84% of them identified as Christian 6 years ago. But then 76% of baby boomers identified as Christian, 67% of Gen Xers identified as Christian, and then 49% of millennials identified as Christian. And then the blue graphs there show kind of similar patterns as far as like weekly church attendance and church involvement. It's way higher for the older they are, and it gets way lower the younger you get. So the stat I really want to point out here is that the younger the generation, the less they identify as Christian, and even doubt God altogether. And we don't even have Gen Z on this graphic. So to talk a little bit about Gen Z, which many of us are members of, right? USD obviously has a bunch of them. Gen Z are kids born between 1995 and 2015. So they're today's 10-year-olds all the way through recent college graduates. And they are the first generation to be born entirely in what's called our post-Christian American culture, where people are now leaving the church in droves, and so we are now considered a post-Christian culture. Okay? And the percentage of Gen Z that identifies as atheist is double that of the general adult population, 13% versus 6%. And then in less than a decade, the proportion of 18 to 29-year-olds who drop out of the church has increased. Nearly 2/3 of young adults who were once regular churchgoers have dropped out at least one time or another. So that's pretty crazy, and just to kind of see this general trend, especially towards Gen Zers who are leaving the church and want nothing to do with religion. And you probably asked the question, why is that the case? Why is this the case? Well, in his book, Faith for Exiles, David Kinnaman from Barna Research Group gives this as a potential reason. Okay? Read this quote with me. One reason is that we live in a time and a place characterized by rampant skepticism about Christianity and the Bible. Hyper-rationalism and pop culture atheism undercut belief. The majority of non-Christian youth and young adults are jaded to the appeal of following Jesus. They reject organized religion altogether, especially claims of an exclusive faith like Christianity, and that you can only come and be saved through Jesus alone. That's what they're saying there. Many view the Bible as a book of oppression that is harmful to the minds of its devoted readers. In some influential places, young Christians encounter condescension or downright hostility from their peers, their instructors, and social elites. So all that to say, yes, being a Christian is becoming more of a social liability these days, but it is especially a larger liability for the younger you are. Because young people especially face more hostility for avid religious belief than those who are from older generations where it's more assumed. So what do we do, What do we do? Do we feel like we're the only ones left, especially for the next generation? And how are we going to see the world and our nation come to know Jesus more, right? Well, thankfully, there is good news. There's always hope, right? There's hope for us, just as there was hope for Elijah. So for us to flip back over to his story, God doesn't let Elijah bemoan for too long. In fact, I love how God gets Elijah back up on his feet, because he doesn't give Elijah this mushy-gushy, encouragement from positive, encouraging K-Love, that you listen to on your radio. He's not like, listen, buddy, life's hard. It's okay. Remember, he says, I got you a to-do list, okay, Elijah, suck it up. Come on, we got things to do. Because there are some of us where the best form of encouragement is just to stay busy, right? Give me tasks to do. That's literally what God does with Elijah here. Listen to this. So let's continue on in verse 15. Then the Lord said to him, go back the way you came. Like, he doesn't even encourage him. He says, go back where you came and go to the desert of Damascus. And when you get there, do these three things. Okay, do these three things. First, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Second, also anoint Jehu son of Nimshi king over Israel. And third, anoint Elisha son of Shaphat from Abel Meholah to succeed you as prophet. Anoint Hazael, anoint Jehu, anoint Elisha. That's his task list. Verse 17. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal and whose mouths have not kissed him. Okay, so first of all, I want us just to notice that God does actually encourage Elijah by saying he's indeed not alone. The Lord has reserved a whole slew of people, 7,000 other prophets who have not turned from him. That's got to be encouraging, right? There's still hope for his people. There's still hope for your culture. There's still hope for you, Elijah. You're not alone. You got a group. Stick to it. But then he gives Elijah this plan to anoint these three people. Why, of all things, does God tell Elisha to do that? To anoint Jehu, to anoint Hazael, and to anoint Elisha? It's because this is God's master plan of purging the evil that was residing in Israel at this time. If you read the rest of 1 Kings and the rest of 2 Kings, eventually you've come to find Jehu is anointed as that king of Israel, and he purges the country of the evil influence of Ahab's house and Jezebel, and he would get rid of Baal worship in the country. He'd purge anyone who had claimed allegiance to Ahab's house and Baal, which is awesome. And then Hazael comes in, he's this king of a neighboring country, and would also come in and wipe out whatever Jehu failed to wipe out. It's a really gruesome story, guys. But after countless reminders of God sending prophets to his people and trying to get their attention, turn from your ways, repent, come back to me, they just wouldn't do it. And so this was the only way how God could get their attention, is to just purge the evil out from them. But here's the kicker. And I don't want us to miss this, okay? Don't miss this. God's plan to purge his people's sin depended on the next generation. It depended on the next generation, because it wouldn't be Elijah who saw God's master plan through, but actually his younger successor, his apprentice, his disciple, Elisha. So although anointing Elisha was the last thing on God's list, that's actually what Elijah does first. Let's continue on in verses 19 through 21. So Elijah went from there and found Elisha, son of Shaphat. He was plowing with 12 yokes of oxen, and he himself was driving the 12th pair. Elijah went up to him and threw his cloak around him. Elisha then left his oxen and ran after Elijah. "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye," he said, "and then I will come with you." "Go back," Elijah replied. "What have I done to you?" So Elisha left him and went back. He took his yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. He burned the plowing equipment to cook the meat and gave it to the people, and they ate. And then he set out to follow Elijah and became his servant. Arguably, this was the most important thing Elijah could have done. God didn't have Elijah go to war with the current generation of Israel. He didn't have Elijah go and fight culture. He already kind of did that on Mount Carmel, right? But rather, to fully purge Israel of its sin, he had Elijah reach someone from the next generation to train him up to take on the sin and corruption of their culture. Because sometimes God's means to purifying culture is through the current generation reaching the next generation. He might call you to something that you will never see come to fruition because he's given you a vision that's all about the next generation's reality for them to carry that through. So if you look at all the stats of Christianity, especially when it comes down to young people and just the generation gaps, you might get discouraged. You might be like Elijah and think there's no hope left. Let's just cower away in our own little bubbles or whatever. But what's so cool is just as God kind of reserved this remnant of 7,000 prophets who hadn't turned from God's ways, there's still kind of a remnant, especially amongst young people, who are avidly devoted to God. And I think it's something that's really encouraging. So going back to Barna's research on 18 to 29-year-olds who grew up as Christian, they identified 10% of them, 10% of them as resilient disciples. We like that, don't we, huh? Resilient disciples who have a number of characteristics about them that make their faith stand out from all the others who claim to be Christians, but they're not really. Maybe they identify as Christians, but they're not practicing. Okay? What are those characteristics? Check this out, because I think all of us can learn from these stats of these young people who have a resilient faith. Here's some characteristics of them, okay? They are Christ followers who, first, attend church at least monthly and engage with their church more than just attending worship services. So sign up for Wednesday nights, Summer in Philippians, okay? Shameless plug. Number 2, trust firmly in the authority of the Bible. Number 3, they are committed to Jesus personally and affirm he was crucified and raised from the dead to conquer sin and death. They believe this is true. Then number 4, and I love this, they express a desire to transform the broader society as an outcome of their faith. This isn't just something they do personally. They want to see people outside of the church walls transformed. But here's some other statistics of resilient disciples. 89% of them say, my relationship with Jesus brings me deep joy and satisfaction, vibrant life, okay? 70% say that in my church, I regularly receive wisdom for how to live faithfully in a secular world. 88% say the church is a place where I feel I belong. 77% say when growing up, I had close personal friends who were adults from my church, parish, or faith community. 72% say that my church does a good job of helping me understand how to live out my faith in the workplace. But look at this last one, a whopping 90% say, I want others to see Jesus reflected in me through my words and actions. Dude, if you want a vibrant life in Jesus that can withstand hardship, do those things. And you're going to be on fire in a culture that wants to snuff Christianity out. And in fact, here's what's also really crazy. On one hand, Gen Z is the most unaffiliated religious demographic, but it's also the one that is getting the most on fire. I don't know how many times you see, the news don't talk about this, but there are revivals breaking out on college campuses all across the nation. So they are both either all in or they're all out. And I believe wholeheartedly that it's coming here too. Yeah. Right? Vince and I talk a lot about this. We're just preparing this, we're just preparing the fire. We're just getting it ready. God is just calling us to try to lay the groundwork for how he wants to sweep through here, because I also firmly believe that the future of the church belongs to Gen Z. Well, it belongs to Jesus, but, the inspiration that's going to come from this next generation is unreal. And what else is just so crucial about this, when you're looking at Gen Zers and these young adults who are so committed to their faith, here's what's true for almost all of them. They almost all report that it's because of their high commitment to, that their high commitment to Christian ethics and mission came from parents who took their faith seriously and a church who took their discipleship seriously. What does that mean? The next generation's allegiance to Christ heavily depends on our current allegiance to Christ. Okay, so obviously we as a church, we really want to reach the young people of Vermilion, right? That's one of our heartbeats. That's what really inspired us to move here and to start this church in the first place. But you also have to recognize, while the church has a really important role in forming young people's lives and their faith, the most important discipleship assignment you have is to your kids. It's to your kids. If they see there is a gap between what you believe and what you practice, they'll think this is all a sham. They can read through the lines, right? But generally speaking, this obviously isn't true for all. There's always exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, if your kids are raised into the way of the church, they're raised into the way of Jesus, and they see you believing this and practicing it, the chances of them avidly following Jesus themselves goes way, way, way up. Because you believe it. So if we want to raise resilient disciples in our own households, that's also where it starts, okay? But additionally, every Elisha needs an Elijah. And perhaps as a mother and a father, but it could also be mother and father figures or mentors, or again, a church that can function as an Elijah that pours into them. My goodness, let me just talk a little bit about my Elijahs for a second. One of my Elijahs was my home church growing up in Fountain City, Indiana. Man, belonging to Fountain City Wesleyan Church, I was a member since I was in the womb. There wasn't a Sunday I missed growing up. But further, what actively grew my faith wasn't just that I participated on Sunday mornings. I was asked as a fifth grader to get involved with our children's ministry by running PowerPoint slides. And then in sixth grade, I was asked to play Percy the Pirate for Sunday morning kids' church. It was because an Elijah figure, I'll never forget her name's Miss Lori, saw something in me and invited me, no matter how young and embarrassing I was in my pubescent self, saw me as capable of being able to minister to my peers. I believe I am in ministry today because I was given an opportunity to press the right arrow key for PowerPoint on Sunday mornings. Not to mention, my mom and dad were actively involved. My dad served on the board. My mom was on staff at that church. I was there for Thursday evening's worship service rehearsal. I was there for both services on Sundays. It was my life. And I loved it. Again, it's not the case for every single person who grows up in the church like that, but I had these Elijah figures in my life to where then, the hope is that I can go and carry that out. And so my dream, right, is that we can have more Elijah churches who can raise up the next generation of Elishas. And that is specifically why Casey and I accepted the call to plant this church, uniquely because there is an amazing opportunity here in Vermilion. In fact, June 1st, today is the 4-year anniversary of when Casey, Amelia, and I just finished driving straight through the night from Marion, Indiana, and pulled into our townhome here in the Madison Park townhome parking lot to make our residence in Vermilion to start church planting. 4 years ago today. We were so sleep deprived. It was awful. But Amelia slept the whole time, so that was great. And our dream was just to see how Vermilion is a hub for the next generation. Get this, 58% of the population of Vermilion is under the age of 30. The median age of Vermilion is 23 years old. Obviously, we're home to USD, right? So unique. And because of that, we just saw this huge gap between the 9,000 some students who are here during the school year and the 18 churches who have none of them attending here. So that's why we set out, and there's a lot of sacrifices you have to make and saying we're going to go all in and trying to we want to reach as many people in Vermilion, right? But our heartbeat is just try to increase the gap, to decrease the gap of the amount of young people who no longer affiliate with Christianity, that we can have some role to play in that here in Vermilion. And it's been nothing short of amazing. Right? If you haven't watched even just our annual report video that came out here recently this month, go on YouTube, check that out, or finally open up your Resilient Church text message, because I know you leave those unread, right? Except Faith. Faith reads them avidly, don't you? Yes, you do. Watch that video, because there's so much to celebrate, even just from this last year of ministry here in this place. But my hope is that we can be an Elijah church that pours into all the Elishas of this next generation. Right? Whether they're a toddler in Resilient Kids, whether it's a resilient teen, a resilient college student, or just any of us in any phase, because all of us are always looking for some mentor figure who's older than us, who's gone before us in some way, shape, and form. It doesn't matter your age. I want us to be a church that is all about that. Something that I love when you hop over to 2 Kings chapter 2, right before Elijah is whisked away from the Lord, or by the Lord on a chariot of fire. I mean, that's a whole other sermon in itself of what happens with that. God just whisks him away on a chariot of fire. Right before he leaves, he asks Elisha, what can I do for you before I am taken from you? Is what he asks. What can I do for you before I am taken from you? And I love Elisha's response, because he says, let me inherit a double portion of your spirit. Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit. So if we want to be an Elijah church, we need to get in the habit of asking our Elishas, what can we do for you before you leave us, before we leave you? And my hope and prayer is that they say, we want a double portion of your spirit. We want a double portion of your influence. We want to be able to double the work and the vision that you have for this place, for the church, for this world, and to see it go to places that you could have only dreamed of. That's my hope. That's my hope. And what you see then through the rest of 2 Kings is how Elisha literally does twice as many amazing things as Elijah does. So that's why today we're actually starting a new 7-week series through the summer called Elisha. It is just an extended study on the character of Elisha and his ministry and all the number of different things we can learn about our life and how to live an avid, resilient faith, in this life, okay? Elisha's amazing. So all that's going to be awesome. We're going to talk about Elisha more. But today, we wouldn't have Elisha had it not been for Elijah, right? So we have to start here and what that all looks like. Because the question I want to ask us is, how can we invest in the next Elisha? For you, maybe that is having more family devotionals and prayer times for you as a family. And it can start as simple as we're going to pray for our meal before we eat at dinner time, right? Or maybe you and your spouse can just have a dedicated time of prayer every night before you go to bed. You try doing family devotions. You try attending church together. Small little habits like that you can do every day that are so attainable of how you can raise your young ones into the faith. But then are there maybe some teens that you want to mentor? Is there a college student who attends Resilient Church that you kind of want to take under your wing, have them over for dinner every Thursday night or something like that? Could you invest in them that way? But there's this really incredible thought that I think is so important for us to always remember, and it's this, that faith is caught, not taught. Faith is caught, not taught. You can teach all of the right things, but if you're not living it out yourself, it doesn't matter what you teach. Living it out is way more effective. It's way more impactful for our people, and especially for your kids. Faith is caught, not taught. So how can we create all of these opportunities for us to influence those around us, especially those in the next generation? But there's one more way we can invest in the next generation of God's people, okay? I'm going to just take a quick moment about this. We're almost done. It's actually by investing in the next generation of churches, okay, that haven't even been born yet. We are a church because Ransom Church came before us. Ransom Church is in Sioux Falls. They're our mother church. They helped us get planted. But Ransom Church wouldn't have even been a church had Linwood Wesleyan Church not planted them as well. You see, every single church that you have ever gone to started as a church plant. And so that's why every year we celebrate Awaken Sunday, which is in celebration of awakening the church, of seeing God come down anew in light of Pentecost, to refresh the church, to waken us up, to send people out, and to plant more churches to reach more people. This pays homage down to Acts chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, when it says, when the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place, the disciples of Jesus. And suddenly a sound like a blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. And all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. And from that moment on, we saw 3,000 people come to faith in Jesus at Jerusalem, and then the movement of the church expanded through Judea and Samaria into the ends of the ancient world. And it continues on today, where we see more and more churches being planted and started and reaching new people. And the reason this matters is because when we're looking at the grand scheme of reaching new people, new baby Christians, you could call them, the next generation of Jesus followers, the most effective way to do so is through church planting. It's through starting new expressions of church who can bring people together, find those who are on either the outskirts of the faith or who are hungering for that next thing and bring them together in one new thing. It's amazing how effective it is. So that's why we are a part of this thing called the Awaken Church Planting Network. Okay? Every year we celebrate this. We want to talk about church planting, but also to recognize that a portion of our funds we give and we support this network so that we can help launch other churches, okay? But I want to go another step beyond that, is that we're not just supporting this church planting network to help launch churches themselves. I still dream of what it could look like for us to plant a church outside of us, too, where we can designate a significant amount of funds to help launch churches in our region. In fact, I think we are uniquely equipped to plant churches that can reach small college towns, small rural college towns. I think we're uniquely gifted in that area. I think of Sioux City, Orange City, Sioux Center, Iowa. There's some towns in Nebraska that have some small colleges. Like, there are places like that could use a vibrant expression of church that can reach this next generation and pull people together in that way. That's what I'm dreaming about. And as you know, the other cards you have on your seats there, we're in this 3-year campaign called the 4 Vermilion Initiative, where we're working hard as a church plant to try to raise the funds for us to be financially self-sustaining as a church. It's why we're launching our community center just right down the hall here. It's why we're doing all these extra efforts to reach people in our community, right? Because the sooner we can get financially stable, where we can support this, the more we can designate funds for future church plants and starting up other ministries and to be avidly starting all of these extra movements to see people come to faith. That's why all of this matters. That's why all this is so important. So just to kind of wrap things up, what is the next person you need to reach? Who is a part of the next generation that you need to disciple? Maybe it's your kid. Maybe it's starting another church. Maybe it's pouring into a baby Christian, someone who just came to faith, that you can lead them into the way of faith yourself. Maybe it's pouring into someone of this next generation, literally. There's so much that we can do. How can we invest in the next? And for us to continue to be an Elijah church.